Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to the 7th edition of SOLS Conversations, hosted by the School of Liberal Studies at BML Munjal University. This series was conceived as a space for reflective, critical, and imaginative engagement with some of the most urgent challenges of our time. It is rooted in the belief that the interdisciplinary dialogue grounded in ethics, rigor, and care is crucial if we are to think and act meaningfully in the face of planetary, political, and social crisis. The evening's event, titled Envisioning Otherwise, Conversations on Alternative Development Ecologies and Learning from the Global South, seeks to open up precisely such a conversation. Across the Global South, and particularly in India, we find ourselves navigating profound contradictions. Developmental aspirations continue to be widespread and deeply felt, but the models available to realize them are increasingly extractive, exclusionary, and ecologically unsustainable. Now, how do we respond to these questions or concerns? What are the alternatives? Are there already alternatives that exist? And how can we reimagine not only what kind of development we want, but how we might build and sustain it collectively within the social political constraints of our time? So, to answer these questions today, we have four panelists with us, and I would take the privilege to introduce them. So our first panelist is Professor Peter Sutoris. Professor Peter Sutoris is a lecturer in education and international development at the University of York and holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge. His research focuses on development, sustainability, civic imagination, and education, particularly in the Global South. He is the co-author of the recent book, Reimagining Development, Bold Directions Towards a Thriving World, published in 2025, which forms the thematic anchor for today's discussion. Drawing on ethnographic work in India and South Africa, Dr. Sutoris interrogates dominant development paradigms and advocates for a rethinking of development as a moral, ecological, and imaginative process. His work invites us to look beyond institutional blueprints and consider how dissent, learning, and cultural memory contribute to more just and sustainable futures. We are also joined by the panelist, Professor Sharachchandra Lele. Dr. Sharachchandra is Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Environment and Development at ATREE, Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, Bangalore, trained in engineering and environmental studies at IIT Bombay, the Indian Institute of Science, and the University of California, Berkeley. His research spans political ecology, sustainable development, and forest government, inclusive of environmental justice. Dr. Lele's work challenges technocratic and depoliticized approaches to sustainability, emphasizing instead the importance of democratic participation, distributive justice, and epistemic plurality. He has contributed significantly to the debates around forest rights, water policy, and ecosystem services in India. His insights are vital to our conversation as we consider how sustainability can be reclaimed from elite agendas and rerouted in democratic bottom-up governance. Our next panelist is Professor Rajeswari Raina. Professor Rajeswari Raina is a professor in the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies at Shiv Nadar Institution of Eminence. A science and innovation policy expert, she holds a PhD in science and technology studies and has worked with institutions such as National Institute of Science, Technology and Development Studies, CSIR, and as a policy advisor in agriculture and rural innovation. Her work explores the intersections of science, knowledge, society, and governance, with a focus on how policy is produced and legitimized in India. Professor Raina has long advocated for co-produced, iterative, and context-sensitive forms of policy making, particularly in the agricultural and environmental sectors. Her voice in today's dialogue is crucial as we reflect on how developmental policy can become more inclusive, responsive, and ethically grounded. And finally, we have with us Professor Anup Dhar. Anup Dhar is a professor of philosophy at the School of Liberal Arts in BML Munjal University. Trained in medicine, he is a former professor of philosophy and psychology. He is a former director, Center for Development Practice. He's also the permanent fellow at the Hans Killian and Lot Kohler Center for Cultural Psychology and Historical Anthropology in Ruhr University, Bochum, Germany. His interdisciplinary scholarships bring together psychoanalysis, critical theory, and development studies. His work explores themes such as post-development praxis and the subjectivity of the neoliberal individual. Professor Dhar invites us to consider how development not only shapes material infrastructures but also reconfigures desire, affects, and ethical life. His psychoanalytic lens helps us to understand why collective action often fails, how aspiration operates under constraint, and what kinds of cells are formed or deformed by the development state. He is the co-author of The World of the Third and the Hegemonic Capital between Marx and Freud, published in 2023, and of the work Dislocation and Resettlement in Development from the Third World to the World of the Third, published by Routledge in 2009. So I welcome all the panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. So to open the session and to share the reflections on the SOLS Conversation series, and the broader vision of the School of Liberal Studies of BML Munjal University, I now invite the Dean of the School of Liberal Studies, Professor Arindam Banerjee, to deliver the welcome address. Sir.
Yeah, thank you, Anish, for the introduction to today's evening of the 7th SOLS Conversations. So it's my pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the School of Liberal Studies at BML Munjal University for this edition of the SOLS Conversations. We imagined the SOLS Conversations, which was launched last year in 2024, and this is now the 7th edition of this, what was imagined as a public platform to foster dialogue and nurture ideas around the most critical issues of our times that kind of affect the everyday life as well as larger structures around ourselves in the current times. The SOLS platform, the SOLS conversations have also tried to bring together different perspectives from various disciplines, rethink many of the concepts with which we have been working for a long time. And in earlier editions of the conversations, we have had very diverse programs, starting with the contestations and the evolution of the Hindi language was the first one that we did. Conversations or panel discussions around the gap between the development and the environmental perspectives, on academic freedom, the relationship between design and liberal arts education. We have had one conversation in this room also that I remember, which was on the questions of ethics and sustainability of consumption. It was titled "Is Consumption a Black Box in Public Policy?" And the last conversations that we had, in the last month, was a blended engagement of development, ecology, memory, nostalgia, and storytelling, which also involves certain film screenings. And today, of course, we have a very interesting panel on envisioning otherwise with an esteemed set of speakers. Without taking too much time and standing between the panel and you, I would just briefly kind of like to say about the journey of the School of Liberal Studies as it has unfolded over the last 2 years. When we began our journey, one of the things that collectively, the team of founding faculty and then more people who have joined us later thought worthwhile was to rethink or revisit the foundational principles of liberal studies as it has evolved over the last maybe 3 decades globally. We thought that of course liberal studies is mandated by its very definition to break the disciplinary boundaries, to evolve a interdisciplinary way of understanding the world. But at the same time, we also thought, or we have attempted to think about what kind of a pedagogy should we adopt in liberal studies. And one of the things that we have evolved is to adopt or at least kind of develop an immersive pedagogy, which brings in the questions about how do we how do we think about the ways of knowing in the current world that we live in. And in that immersive pedagogy, we have tried to think about the more traditional boundaries between the classroom and the field, and raise this question that is the field also not a classroom? We have tried to think about the boundaries between an university and the larger community, and engage with the question as to the traditional way historically as centers of learning has looked at subjects of study, which has always come with some kind of a power relation. Is it possible to learn with communities? Is it possible to learn with the quote unquote subjects of study? Is it necessary that all the repository of the knowledge lies with the expert sitting within the university, or are there actually innovative things that are happening which we often don't see because our frameworks blind us towards those things? So those are some of the questions that we have kind of looked at. Can the when we are living in a globalized world, is it possible to blend the local context, bring in the local context, even as we don't reject the worldly insight? So in short, when we are studying, we definitely should not dismiss the subjects of study. And it is also not necessary that we have to romanticize the subjects of study, but can we have a critical reflection and learn together? In terms of development, also as it has progressed, and we'll definitely hear more from the panelists today, it has always been the forte of the state, the capital, and the quote unquote expert. And many development models and its failures that we see are often probably because the human responses and the ecological responses through the so-called development models were never taken into account, or could not be understood, could not be fathomed, because the frameworks were often closed. So in that sense, I think the today's topic, and you can see that the otherwise is in bold. So envisioning the otherwise becomes very important. What got left out as we thought of a development path, as we thought of development, who got left out, what ideas got left out, and how they can come back when we think of alternatives, how they can come back in a very democratic manner without another set of experts imposing that a new model which we keep coming up. So that's a great opportunity. Today's panel discussion is a great opportunity for us to rethink development, rethink even the concept of development perhaps. And that really blends in with the imagination that we are building of liberal studies in the school for the last couple of years. So I would like to thank all the panelists today, especially for really joining us for these interesting conversations. And without further delay, I would like to welcome all of you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Aridham, for the welcome address. Uh, Now to lead us through the main event, the evening's conversation with our four distinguished panelists, I would like to introduce you all to our moderator, Professor Soumyajit Dhar. Soumyajit Dhar is the Assistant Dean of Admissions and Outreach and the founding faculty member at the School of Liberal Studies, BML Munjal University, with a PhD in Sustainability Studies from ATREE, which is Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, and over for 15 years of experience. His research examines the socio-psychological drivers of conspicuous consumption in India and its environmental impact. His interdisciplinary work integrates environmental studies, psychology, and design education, aiming to foster broader perspectives on sustainability and ecological well-being. A founding faculty member of the SOLS and an interdisciplinary scholar working on environmental psychology, sustainability and transitions and political ecology. We welcome him and let's have a round of applause for him as well. Professor Soumyajit, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anish. As we start the discussion, before I introduce the format of the discussion, I would like to kind of put a few disclaimers. One of them is that, we are trying to be slightly ambitious in what we are trying to do, but as I think Professor Arindam has outlined, the purpose of these conversations are to open up conversations which we generally don't delve on or generally engage with. To let us begin the context, I'll just use few minutes to just set the context and then we'll go into the discussion. Although we'll have a kind of a structured approach to the whole discussions, but as we like to keep it, generally we keep the conversations more free-flowing and we might slightly change track based on how the conversations are emerging. Just to begin, I think we are living in a world where environment and development is constantly pitted against each other, and development by which I means more like material development as we see. And there is definitely a need for development for the large section of the world populations. Definitely much of them resides in this country. And we are in the midst of a major environmental collapse of all fronts. But one thing that we sometimes miss in this picture is that people who have enough, quote unquote, so-called 15% of the world population, or maybe 20 at most, are not the happiest people on earth. And just because they are not the happiest people, we have to fundamentally look at this whole developmental model at the very core, because even if we manage to improve efficiency of productions and consumptions and society, we might not really be able to deliver the fundamental good that we were supposed to deliver by any economic or social development, which is individual and societal well-being. So if that is the scenario, within this context, we are opening up this conversation that how we look for alternatives. Now, I would like to kind of zoom into the context of the global south, or if you say maybe South Asia. And in that context, we all would agree that we have a very strong developmental aspirations for having more material, more energy-oriented lifestyle, and that is prevalent in as we just go around, and there are a lot of anthropological research substantiating that. But in that kind of a context, we see the divides between the have and the have-nots is constantly increasing, and those who have managed to protect themselves from the environmental damages and the vagaries to the large extent. One of the classic examples is the use of air purifiers in the city we are sitting. In about 2 months, the air qualities will keep deteriorating, and each one of us might have access to air purifiers, which is kind of an inverted quarantine strategy, and those who are exposed to that air would lose their lung capacity at an exponential rate. And in that kind of a context, we are almost seeing a a massive failure of collective action, where we know what is the right thing to do. At least we can assume that we know, but none of us do what is the right thing to do. Because we feel that anyway, even if I do, others will not do, and therefore let me not do it as well. And in that context, one hand we have developmental aspiration, in that another hand we have massive collective action failure leading to inverted quarantine, where almost the government is saying inherently that either you be rich or you be dead. In that kind of a context we are sitting, and we are talking about alternative development, because there is no other way forward. At least that's how we see it. If we cannot keep on continuing in the same path, 15% of the world population has breached many planetary boundaries. We definitely need Mars and whatever, many other planets to be able to think about for the 85% of the people at the same level of development. If we believe on Elon Musk, maybe we can do. So now with that context, the format of the discussion is going to be broadly centered around, we'll start with a recent book that Dr. Anish has mentioned by Peter. He will speak for about 15 minutes, but it's about the book, but also within this large context, what I just opened up. And after that, we will request Dr. Sharachchandra Lele to put his comments in against what Peter has put, or also what the questions that I broadly kind of outlined. And then Professor Raina, and then Professor Dhar. So in that order we'll go, and after that we'll kind of open it up for the general conversations, and we'll see how it goes. So on that, I'll hand it over to Peter.
Thank you, and thank you for organizing this event. I think it's a very important topic and set of questions that we are looking at today. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for all your hard work in putting this together. So as you have heard already, I'm here partly because I co-wrote this book with my colleague Uma Pradhan on reimagining development. Just recently come out a couple of months ago, and I suppose there are some ideas in this book that speak to the questions that are animating this event. So I'm just going to try and outline a few. There's quite a bit more in there, but I'll just try and give you a taste for some of the arguments and some of the ideas that we present in this book. We open with this paradox at the heart of development, where on the one hand, development historically, if you think all the way back to the post-World War II moment, was a way to imagine a different kind of world. It was a way to think about moving from destruction towards something creative, something productive, towards something different. It was a way of imagining otherwise. And yet, over decades, it's very much become the opposite. It's become a way of narrowing our imagination about the future, where we tend to think of the future as largely predetermined, as not something that we can actively shape, that we are empowered to shape. And so something's happened, something's changed. That's the question that we want to sort of focus on, and that we open with. And this narrowing of the imagination is also reflected if you were to look at the many books that have been written about development over the years, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. Almost all of them focus on the question of how to achieve development. What is this sort of secret to becoming a so-called developed country? There's this whole genre of the development blockbuster book, books by people like Jeffrey Sachs, Paul Collier, Bono, right? There's a whole genre. And what these books are about is, what is the recipe? What is it that a country has to do? What is the policy mix that has to be put together to achieve development? What is largely absent from that conversation is, what is the end goal? What is the kind of world that we are trying to create? Again, if you think back to the idea of development as a world-making or remaking project, what is it that we're making? What are we imagining will be at the end of this process? And by and large, the imagination of that endpoint is basically an emulation of that sort of Western industrial, post-industrial model that Soumyajit was talking about, with all of its pathologies, with all of its issues. And I think that then raises questions of, is this really the kind of world that we want? We also, in this book, try to look at the accumulated critiques of development over the decades. There have been many, 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 going all the way back to the 1960s, even 1950s in some places. Many of them have been forgotten. Many of them never really left the academic bubble. They were ideas that were discussed extensively in universities, but rarely outside of universities. And we try to do this kind of intellectual archaeology of the critique of development and think about what do these ideas, what do these critiques say to the present moment? You know, we tend to think that if something was written in the 1970s or the 1980s, it's no longer relevant. It was responding to the state of the world at that point in time. But actually, what we argue in this book is that the current state of the world, the overlapping crises that we face, very much call for bringing back those accumulated debates and those accumulated critiques, not as something obsolete, not as something to be kept inside the ivory tower, but something very much to be debated publicly, something to inform how our democracies function as we navigate the future and try to think about the kind of world that we are trying to make. An important point that we make in the book is that imagination is not just simply about being able to envision alternatives. Imagination begins with recognizing the reality that we are in, recognizing that what we consider to be normal may not actually be normal, recognizing that there is nothing self-evident about the state of the world as it is. We talk about the idea of a development autopilot, the idea that in many organizations, also in many academic disciplines, I would argue largely in the field of development economics, for example, there is a kind of autopilot where we have accepted certain assumptions, certain ideas of what it means to be human in the world, of what it means to be modern, you know, what it means to be developed. And these assumptions, by going unquestioned, then basically mean that, you know, we are not truly reflecting on this kind of a soup that we are swimming or drowning in, if you will, this sort of soup of development. So how do we break away from that? How do we recognize the reality that we are in, not as something self-evident, but as something that we can look at from the outside? Well, this is something that anthropology, of course, teaches us as a discipline. You know, the idea that you could be a participant and an observer at the same time, that you could actually develop a critical distance from that in which you are participating. And so a lot of the literature that we cite and a lot of the ideas that we borrow do come from anthropology for this reason, because we believe that that critical distance is crucial to a reimagination of the world. One such idea comes from anthropological literature on imagination itself, where if you look at that literature, what you learn, among other things, is that modern societies, so-called developed societies, one of the things they do is they create this very rigid distinction between reality and imagination, where something is either real or imagined. It's not a very permeable boundary between the two. You know, anybody who's met a child knows that children don't really recognize this boundary. They tend to ask questions that might sound silly. We tend to label those questions as childish because we have this very firm boundary that we have internalized from society about imagination and reality being in some ways opposites. But again, in the anthropological literature on imagination, that boundary becomes blurred, and we learn that different societies, different cultures at different points in time have had very different relationships with imagination and did not necessarily see the concept of reality and the concept of imagination as separate or as somehow antithetical. So again, that is another very important thing to realize. One of the kind of practical ways, I guess I have about 5 more minutes, so one of the sort of practical ways that we try to sort of offer some tools or questions or ways of thinking about this to the reader is in the chapter of the book about narratives and about stories. And one of the things that this book tries to do is to help advance this new proposed field of development humanities. Again, development is very much dominated by economics, and there have been voices that have been calling for development humanities as a sort of response to this. So this is one of the things we're trying to do is to sort of outline what that might look like. And we believe that stories and narratives are a crucial way to try and understand development. We think about the story of development by applying the dramatic structures that you see in sort of drama studies or theater studies or in literature of the three acts of the setup, the confrontation, and the resolution. And we ask, what is the setup of the development story? What is the confrontation in the development story? And what is the resolution of the development story? The setup of the development story is this idea that prior to development, there is a static territory of nothingness and of perpetual human misery. And in the book we look at to what extent does this actually hold up? What are the kinds of, what is the evidence for that? But also, you know, how do we actually get sort of brainwashed into believing that that is the case? You know, because at the moment, if you look at low-income communities or communities living in poverty, you know, we all know about sort of the pornography of poverty, if you will. You know, that is something that shapes our imagination in a very powerful way. But at the same time, there are very few places around the world that are untouched by the idea of development. And so then to what extent is that way of life that we see in these images representative of what life was like before development, and to what extent is it representative of how development has reshaped the world and the kind of inequality that it has caused? And we look at some really interesting historical work from economic historians who have looked at historical patterns of things like malnutrition. You know, to what extent are these natural phenomena that simply just exist in human societies? To what extent are these products of so-called modernity and development? We then look at confrontation. You know, so what is the assumption in the development narrative about how we move from an underdeveloped towards a developed society? And here we look at two books, one which was published in the 1960s, which talked about the modernization theory of development, stages of economic growth, that basically argued that all societies move through these linear stages where you sort of move from the so-called traditional society towards the so-called modern society. And we look at another book which was recently published a couple of years ago by a major figure in development economics, and we compare the two books and basically conclude that not much has changed in the discourse in the last 60 years, and that actually the way that we think about development in the mainstream of academia very much is the way we thought about it in the 1960s, with all of the waves of feminism, of decolonization, different social movements for indigenous rights that have happened in the meantime, not really making much of a dent in that conversation. And so we sort of talk about this idea of these parallel discourses and the ways that this confrontation, you know, the way the confrontation of the development narrative happens has remained largely unchanged and static and not responsive to the kinds of conversations that we are having here today. And then we look at the resolution. So once you reach development, you know, what happens? And here some of the points that Sumyajit was talking about become very relevant. You know, are the societies, the so-called developed societies, truly societies of well-being? Are they societies of human flourishing? Are they societies where people find fulfillment? You know, if we use Amartya Sen's language of capabilities, you know, are there societies where people are able to develop their capabilities and to exercise their capabilities? And we look at some of the statistical evidence. We look at, you know, development as measured on its own terms. Does it actually deliver on what it claims to be delivering on? And if you look closely, you know, what do you see? And so the point of that exercise of sort of breaking it down into these three parts and looking at each one carefully is not to get depressed or fatalistic about the world's prospects. It is to actually create some space for imagination, because imagination, true imagination, can really only happen through awareness, through a deeper understanding of reality, and by switching off that autopilot of development. And the very last thing I would like to say is just that we very consciously, in the way that we frame this book, talk about the idea that we don't want imagination to become the next buzzword. The history of development is full of buzzwords. We don't want development imagination, which is the concept that we propose in the book, to become part of that tradition. We don't want it to be co-opted. We don't want it to become a label that loses its meaning. And in the final chapter of the book, we think about what that would mean in practice. What is the role of education in ensuring that this critical edge is not lost, for instance. And so I would just like to basically finish by saying that it's important, as much as it is important to talk about imagination and development, it's equally important to ensure that it doesn't become just a tokenistic phrase that becomes hollow, because history is full of such phrases. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. So I think Peter has brought about a very macro level picture of the narrative of how imagination, there is hardly any imagination of development and the autopilot mode. I will now request Sharad to kind of open up from the more grounded approach. What is his take on this question? Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to begin by thanking the SOLS for inviting me here and giving me this opportunity of interacting with an audience which is very mixed, which is also a challenge. We have eminent people like Professor Babu and Professor Menon, as well as the next generation of scholars, thinkers, as well as actors. And what really struck me in the introduction to the program itself that Arindam you gave, or Anish said earlier also, the idea of combining thinking with acting. Think and act together. And I think that's really crucial for all of us, because thinking can be very dry, and at the end of the day you might feel unproductive, as in a way tangentially Peter mentioned that we have been thinking and critiquing the idea of development for decades. And I happen to be part of that, having written a critical review of sustainable development way back in 1991, and still reflecting on it so many years later, it feels like, well, I don't know if I had any impact beyond getting a few citations. So it is really challenging to, when if you're only in the space of thinking. And the space of acting can be more exciting when you're on the other side of the divide. But then when you are in that space, at some point you end up repeating the same old mistakes and getting trapped in that same old rut of, often becoming like any other NGO and so on. And the challenge for me is doubly so, because not only is this audience very diverse, but also because I'm coming now, I think, from a very different space. I'm just coming out. I feel I've just come out of Bastar or come out of the Baigachak region of Madhya Pradesh, where I've been working for the last 4 or 5 years. And one of the reasons I'm in Baigachak is because of my student Venkat's work there with the Baigas in the forest villages. And the last 5 years, we've embarked on a very different kind of mission, a very action research, or shall I say primarily action and some research mission, to help communities get rights to their forests so that they can manage their forests themselves under the Forest Rights Act. And that is that gives you a sense of fulfillment, the act part of think and act. And now it is a challenge to come back and start thinking about what are we really doing there. And one of the things that really strikes me is that the talking about imagination, the slogan that really galvanizes the Adivasi community is still Jal Jangal Zameen Hamara Hai. And this is a slogan that was actually coined not in the Hindi speaking or the Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh part of central India, but actually in Telangana by Kumaram Bhim, who's now been captured in rather imaginatively in the movie RRR, which most of you might have seen. And Kumaram Bhim's revolt still remains unresolved. Whereas if you go across the border into Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh, mostly Chhattisgarh you might see, or Maharashtra, Gadchiroli, you actually see some progress towards autonomous control of their Jal Jangal Zameen, at least the jungle part of it. You cross back into the border of into Telangana and you feel like you're back in 1930s or 20s where the colonial zamindars are replaced by our own zamindars, and the story is pretty much the same as before, and therefore massive tensions between Adivasis and the forest department and the state and the zamindars and so on. So it's really interesting to see that in terms of action, we have inched forward in a few areas in terms of this Jal Jangal Zameen idea, that Jal Jangal Zameen belongs to the people, especially the most marginalized, the indigenous population of this country. But that imagination still continues to hold sway. That slogan still carries a certain amount of power that rallies people around it. And I think that's the importance of this idea of imagination, that you need to have a picture of where you want to go, even if you don't necessarily have figured out the strategy of how you will get there. Having said that, I think one of the things that strikes me repeatedly, looking at the kind of changes that have also happened in central India, which affect their imagination as well, is the fact that this idea of development has percolated into the deepest part of the country, or the most remote parts of this country, in certain ways. And whereas sitting in Delhi, in an English-speaking intellectual crowd, we might critique the idea of GDP, the idea of economic growth and so on, very legitimately, and I've been part of that, the people who have critiqued that. The word growth and development translates very differently in the hinterland. It gets the word vikas. It becomes the word vikas, and vikas has a very powerful capacity to capture, again, people's imagination in certain ways, because it's been reduced to something very tangible and very attractive. It is reduced to ideas of, bijli, pani, PM Awas, Sadak. So it's in very tangible terms, people see vikas as something that they want. And it's easier to critique GDP here in an intellectual sense, much harder to talk to a villager and say, well, this vikas of Sadak, Pani, Bijli is something that you don't want. That statement doesn't make sense, actually. That statement, in a very bald sense, is not palatable, or it's not going to be meaningful to the villager. So, in that reimagination, with Jal Jangal Zameen, we need to include other dimensions as well. Jal Jangal Zameen is a slogan from the 1930s, but in the 2030s, we need to be thinking in terms of Jal Jangal Zameen as well as Bijli, Udyog, Vyapar, all as part of Hamara Hai. That the indigenous community must control not just their land, that is their agriculture, their forest and their water, but also whatever else that is done with that, whether it is in the form of industry, whether it is in the form of energy, whether it is in the form of trade, and therefore, of course, the form of governance. That they must be able to govern themselves in ways that we have not sufficiently imagined, let alone allowed to translate on the ground. And I think this idea of democratic governance is something that we can share in common with those communities, because I'm sitting in Bangalore, one of the what is it called, the IT capital of India. And since the Brihat Bengaluru Mahanagar Palike was formed, the Greater Bangalore Corporation was formed in 2007, we have had only 2 elections to the corporation. And our corporation has been suspended, or has not had an elected body for the last, 7 years. I think it's the longest unelected corporation in the country. So, in that sense, the absence of a democratic governance system is common, whether you are in the Adivasi hinterland of India or even in the urban IT capital of India, that we do not really, as citizens of this country, we do not really have much of a say in what's going on around us, except, of course, if you happen to be the elite of Bangalore who then have direct access to the elite of, in the political system. So I think we also can turn a full circle and say what that Jal Jangal Zameen Hamara Hai slogan is really trying to say to us is that everywhere that we live, we need to have an imagination of a much more democratized country than what we are in today. And how do we visualize that idea of a democratic governance? In the face of, and I think in the critics of democratic governance, often you will find us environmentalists on the other side, where we will say, oh, if you allow democratic governance, we'll not be able to save the tiger. If you allow democratic governance, then this will not happen, that will not happen. We are in a hurry, as Peter has pointed out often, to decarbonize. And maybe democratic governance will just come in the way of decarbonization, and we should just get rid of all these silly politicians and just appoint technical experts so that we can quickly decarbonize. So the environmental imagination has often struggled with or been in direct opposition to the idea of a democratic imagination or a democratically governed society. And I think one of our challenges is to be able to reconcile, not necessarily as saying that, well, A will ensure B, but more in terms of it doesn't matter if A does not ensure B or B does not ensure A. Both of these are equally desirable. We need an environmentally just and sustainable society at the same time that we need that definition of what is environmentally just and what is sustainable to be arrived at democratically. Because we will never have one definition or one imagination of what is environmentally sound or sustainable. And therefore we need a process which is highly democratic, deeply democratic, and therefore in the, based in the vernacular, not just in this room, but we should be having similar conversations right across the country in local languages, in their own idiom. I'm going to stop there and then just pass it on to Raj.
Thank you, Sharath. So I think Sharath has brought about this idea of how the role of democracy is so important. I would now request Rajeswari to kind of open up the discussion of how the policy making happens in the country, and also from her work on post-growth, degrowth perspective. More looking at how India as a country, or South Asia broadly speaking, how we can navigate this, the tensions that have already been brought up.
Thank you, Samji. That's quite a tall ask, and I'm sorry, I'm not perhaps the best person to take on all those questions. But thank you very much to the School of Liberal Studies for again giving me this opportunity to be here with you today. Again, like Sharath said, I also very humbly acknowledge the presence of Professor Babu, Professor Menon, whom we've all learned from. I'd like to, I wish I had read the book too before coming here. So let me just share, the organizers have asked me to speak, mainly addressing historically aware, ecologically grounded, and socially just responses to what the book raised, how book race is about reimagining development, right? So let me just focus on the first two, historically aware and ecologically grounded, and leave the social justice part to you, Anup. So, there are, let's say, when we talk about, the ways in which development is imagined, we just heard about Jal Jangal Zameen, people want bijli, good food, sadak chahiye. In my undergraduate class, when I asked them to look at development, many of them speak about the highway, there is this expressway, and then some of them gradually talk about inclusion and say, well, there is this National Highway Authority of India ka board hai, jisme likha hai, we don't make just roads, we build the nation. And then uske niche there's in smaller letters they write, but no bullock carts, motorcycles, two-wheelers allowed, right? So that's building the nation is for those who own cars. Building the nation is for those who can, take this fancy buses, some other buses too, but the point is, it's meant for some section of the population. So development, as in what kind of sadak is the question. Sadak chahiye, sabko chahiye, but It's not the question. So reimagining development, reimagining good, safe, healthy food is also important. Well, again, something that I teach. What we consume today as, well, the Green Revolution food, right? I mean, it's good food, yeah. There's rice and wheat and plenty, but it's deficient in 9 major minerals and micronutrients. This is not something that we discovered now. We've known this since 1998. The question is, what have we done about it, right? The reimagination has not yet happened. Sharad, like he said, has had more than enough citations 1991 onwards on that sustainability paper. But nobody is taking that seriously, in the sense, nobody is asking the question about why did we have to bring in sustainable development as opposed to sustainability, right? The prefix to development did something to completely distort the idea, and again, to make it palatable to the mainstream of development. So I'm just going to focus on why we have this, well, historically and institutionally, well, contextualized envisioning. We have to understand that we are in a system that is unfortunately very, very resilient. It's not for lack of knowledge. We know that. 1991, Sharad's paper, there's so many other excellent authors. Georges Quiroga in 1975, telling us that the global economy will collapse not because of lack of resources or resource access, but because of the heat of the pollution, that is, the heat of global warming will make the global economy collapse. 1975, Energy and Economic Myths. We've known this. The question is, the reimagining is not happening. It's a very resilient system, a resilient, unsustainable system. The two don't go together, right? That's what we've been taught, but they do. We know that there is a system that makes this thing work. Well, the unsustainable system work. It keeps reinventing itself. Carbon taxes is what we started with, yeah? But then we moved quickly to carbon trading, yeah? The carbon markets came up, and now we've all bought into carbon markets, environmentalists included, right? I mean, so why are we doing that? Part of the reason is because, again, institutionally unhinged, that is not, well, let's say, located in the rules and norms that need to be there, but something that is being sustained by a few. Today we had a great lecture in my university by Professor Anirban Chakravarti from JNU, where he said that if you have a salary of more than 20 lakhs in this country, you're part of 1%, the top 1% of the country, that is the top 1% of, well, income in the country, income groups in this country. It was a bit, well, all of us felt a little ashamed, a little cringe of conscience just hearing that, yeah? Those of us who have salaries. The point is, this is a world where our imagination of development has become so institutionally unhinged. The rules and norms of what we saw as a middle class is no longer there, yeah? So how and where are we trying to locate a new imagination of development? We have to get back to studying these, well, patterns of distribution, institutions, rules and norms that were there with us. Historically aware, historically and institutionally grounded responses. We know that there are examples, hundreds of examples. We have the Timbuktu Collective, we have very, very small collectives of, well, manufacturing, rural manufacturing that are sustainable. We don't seem to be learning from them. Well, in a book that we did on post-growth thinking, Julian Francois Gerber and I put together a book which was published in 2018. Many of you here have chapters in that. But what we said in that book was that, well, we will not just focus on what's given to us as questioning GDP. We won't just do that. We'll say, what are the alternatives available in this country? Is degrowth, post-growth thinking just Eurocentric? Is it all just happening in the north? Are we just buying things from there as ideas? Or do we have these original questions that came up here in India? So we have many of our leaders, politicians, intellectuals, freedom fighters, of course, Tagore, Brother Kamal Mukherjee, C.T. Kurian, an academic, several people, J.C. Kumarappa, questioning the idea of growth and saying that there is another way to see the economy. The question that we have to ask is, why hasn't that taken root? Why in a country where there is I mean, these are just a few names. There's a really exceptional lady who works in an NGO run by Tarak Kate in Vidarbha region. I call her Tuljama Georges Kurojan. She's so rich in her knowledge, so rich in her understanding of energy and material transactions in their village. I mean, it's amazing that there is such rich academic material, academic in the conventional sense, such rich experiential learning available in this country. We don't seem to be using that. Part of the reason is what, J.C. Kumarappa says, a centralized approach to everything. Decentralization, deliberative capacities. Again, Ashish Kothari and others have written about this, saying a radical ecological democracy is possible. We've seen Mendeleeka. There are small examples in this country, yes. But policy making here doesn't seem to be learning from this. We can cite umpteen reasons why they don't learn from this, right? Vested interest is one of them. But even without vested interests, many of us seem to be buying into this idea of, growth, for instance, right? We need growth. For what? I mean, today, like I said, it was embarrassing, a cringe of conscience that, we are 1% of the top 1% income group in this country. It's unimaginable. I mean, this is the world that we're living in. We've had enough material in this country, again, about what we want in terms of development, in terms of, good food. I mean, roti, kapda or makan, ranging from Indira Gandhi's days onwards, we've heard a whole range of slogans. What we have today as sustainable development, again, demands a re-envisioning. It is not just envisioning, right? So, because why does the shift from limits to growth, 1972, to sustainable development happen in 1987, right? What is it that makes that shift so important? And again, so subtle and well hidden that everybody buys into it. We've all bought into it. Part of the reason is that sustainable development does not allow scope for the reimagination that is needed, the kind of reimagination, the kind of critical questioning that is needed for the reimagination. You don't need that, because economic growth and all this that I said is all the lack of nutrition in the rice and wheat that we eat, to the kind of, let's say, income inequality that we are all living through, that we're all partly responsible for, that is enshrined in sustainable development, because economic growth is one of the key pillars of sustainable development. You need economic growth, ecological sustainability, and social sustainability. All three pillars, right? How did that economic growth get reinstated into sustainable development? It was, unfortunately, a kind of, let's say, a semantic, you mentioned language, a semantic twist given to Mrs. Gandhi's speech, that the poor need growth. Where does that come from? The poor need growth because they have to have access resources, they have to have jobs, they have to have, it's not just zameen, naukri chahiye, establishments, manufacturing. It comes from, again, an imagination of what's been given to us is a particular, it's not just a question of jobs, right? It's a question of how you make these jobs work, what kind of investments are needed, what kind of planning is needed. The idea of growth that is enshrined in our planning efforts, all these have been, again, repeatedly questioned. I'm just kind of repeating myself when I say that we've questioned these before. One of the problems with this degrowth, post-growth imagination has been that, people say, how can we degrow? Why should India even think about degrowth? It's because of this inequality that we have here, first and foremost. And two, because our growth is creating more poverty. One of the concepts that has been enshrined in, again, why was Mrs. Gandhi's speech picked up? Because the assumption was, again, whether it's this government or the previous governments that we've had, the assumption is that if you give tax incentives to the top 1%, if you give corporates a little, forget the environmental regulation, theek hai, thoda pollution, theek hai, it's okay, then they will get more incomes, and those incomes will be reinvested, and that reinvestment will create perhaps more firms, more businesses, more jobs, and the poor will need that, right? The idea of trickle down is so deeply embedded in our minds that we can't shake that off. And it's been I'm not saying this is my finding. H.W. Arndt, 1950s, 1970s, even Illich. I mean, so many people have said this. The point is, it's nothing new. A reimagination needs, well, let's say, the power to shake up some of these fundamental concepts that we are so deeply dyed in. We've all been, well, dyed in the wool academics here. Sorry, but that's the way we are. We have to learn to question some of these fundamentals. Trickle down is bunkum. It's never going to happen. Inequality will only increase with the kind of, well, opportunities for savings and investments that we give. The assumption in some of these models, some of these, well, let's say, well, neat dual sector models, industry, agriculture, doesn't even exist in the material reality of the tropics. Yeah, we're not even talking about well, anywhere in the world, but especially not here. Ecologically grounded envisioning. Sorry, I won't take too much time, just 2 minutes more. I've taken too much time with the history and institutions bit. Ecologically grounded envisioning, concepts like waste. I mean, any of us who drive out of Delhi towards the Karnal side or the the Ghaziabad side, you see these mountains of waste. We call it externality in economics. There is nothing called waste in nature. Nothing. Nature doesn't have the concept of waste. Everything is used, recycled, reused. I mean, some of these toxins are reduced probably, but the point is we specialize in it as economists, as people who live in this kind of a, well, burgeoning middle class. We specialize in creating waste. Reduce is a concept that we have to bring back. Recycle, reuse, not enough. 6% of all material extraction is reused and recycled. Not done. We have to reduce, and that's where degrowth and post-growth thinking comes in. Reduce is important, otherwise we'll be forced to shrink, and forced to shrink in very, very painful ways. That's a big waste, is a big ecologically grounded lesson that we have to take into account. Emergent properties. There are excellent pieces of work, academic work, also some work by local organizations like Deccan Development Society and so on, that have proven that hunger and poverty are emergent properties of an unequal and ecologically unsustainable system. Hunger and poverty are emergent properties is a concept that ecologists work with all the time. As social scientists, as economists, there's no space for something like that. We are so used to the microeconomic foundations of macroeconomics that we don't even imagine that something like emergent properties can work there's a concept like that from ecology, can work in our economic systems. We don't even think that way, right? So I'm just going to wind up by saying two things that are actually painful for us as academics today, especially those academics who teach environmental social sciences to young students. The environmental social sciences, the three most important ones that actually account for some of these concepts that I've spoken about today, especially questions of nature, justice, and time. Time, again, a very important concept that we've dropped from economics and planning, other than target achievements in particular time points, right? All the environmental social sciences, especially ecological economics, political ecology, and environmental history, are increasingly turning to questions of science, technology, and society, that is, the relationships between these entities. Asking questions about how we know. How do we know about, well, the ways in which nature is being, well, destroyed, degraded, the relationships between our activities, some of the concepts that we've been, well, like I said, brought up right in the world economists, right? So there are questions about, that is, the STS questions are really important. And two, some of the fundamental questions, for instance, Abhijit Sen, again, a very, very important economist who's been a thinker, leader for many of us who, well, ventured into agricultural studies. He inaugurated a conference that we did on India soils in 2018, which we organized in IIT Delhi. And he said soils should be declared public goods. Land can be privately owned. Well, we've been used to that system now. But let's at least take soils out of the hands of private property owners and say soil is a public good. It's something that nature makes over centuries of work. And we can't let that be degraded. If you abuse your child, the state takes over, right? The state takes over the child to bring up the child as a decent citizen. Why can't we do that with soils? The idea of private property, the idea of nature as natural capital, It didn't come about by accident. It came up through 200, 300 years of struggle. Nature becomes natural capital. Human beings, we become human capital, right? Are we human capital or are we citizens? What are we? I mean, reimagining development demands that we ask some of these fundamental questions. I really hope schools like the School of Liberal Studies will help students ask these questions, ask them through expertise and experiential learning together. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajeswari. So I think we have touched upon the question of imagination, democratic development, democratic processes, as well as the idea of the decentralization. And one of the common thread that one can see between all this is the neoliberal subject who and with their own psychic dimensions. So I would now request Anup to kind of look at that question of the psychologically or psychically the neoliberal subject or the modern subject, how he plays, because we have seen that many things have been attempted, but nothing much has happened. And the question is why, if we can delve on that question.
Thank you, Somajit. Let me start with what Professor Raina and Professor Lele has set up, actually. One, if we look at the neoliberal regime, it's not an economic or a financial form only. It is a deeply psychological form, production of a new subject, actually, which I feel Arindam, the economist, missed, actually. Foucault's book on the biopolitical, the production of human capital. Land and labor are not just resource for capital anymore. The human being is capital. The child is capital for the parents, something that our Center on Child and Youth is also looking at. And education becomes for the production of human capital. So there is a fundamental shift in how we begin to look at ourselves, and I think Professor Raina kind of reached that point when she brought up this angle. So that is number one. But what I want to share today is somewhat like this. It's changed as I've listened to all three of you. I was walking with Achla ji. He Southern जमीन नहीं रहेगा तो आदिवासी नहीं बचे. Very interestingly, Sharad, actually, what was their idea, Jal Jangal Zameen, we have replaced it with what we will give them. Bijli, Sarak, Pani, Kapra, Makan, what we will give them now. And we want them to be subjects, not subjects actually, objects of our benevolence. So, we don't want others to be claimants, others to make demands. We want them. And we want their imagination to be curated by what they will receive rather than what they have. Number one, we take away what they have, and then we make them objects of our benevolence. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So I really want to build on that, actually. And in that sense, Somajit, envisioning, otherwise the line came to me as the session was going on, the other is wise. The other is not the other is not unwise, the other is not underdeveloped, the other is not superstitious only. Okay, there are problems with the other as well, but the other is also wise. And we have denied that to the other. and we have declared ourselves wise, self-certified ourselves, people who have written the prescription called development without meeting the patient. So that is development, actually. And sorry to say this, Professor Raina, that is policy sometimes, actually, public policy. Sometimes is to write prescriptions without seeing the patient. So in that sense, development, I like Sharat's point that how does it get worked out in a group of people, actually. It's not only Jal Jungle Zameen anymore, or perhaps it was never that. There are layers and layers and layers and layers, and we have never had the time to sit down and listen, to sit down and have a conversation. And had we sat down to have a conversation, we would have seen number of things. One, it's not a simple picture, which Peter does very, very well in his introduction. I've only managed to read the introduction. He does it very, very well. Please don't come down with prescriptive development. That too without talking to anybody. Okay. Sit down, have a conversation. It's a complex picture. It's a contradictory picture. It's overdetermined. It's not one picture. It's not a homogeneous picture at all. But do we have the patience and the time to sit down and have a conversation, have a long-term conversation and understand what is it that somebody wants? If we had done that, we would have seen, one, the other is wise, the other is a rich repository of know-how, not just, that's the practice angle, Sharad, as well. The other is not, we have denied them knowledge, we have certified ourselves to be knowledgeable. But our knowingness actually misses a fundamental point that the other has know-how. And know-how is a coupled word with a hyphen, know-how. Our mothers have know-how. Cooking is know-how. And the other is not just context. The other is also a rich repository of concepts. So we have given ourselves concepts and made the other space context. And that is a significant problem, actually. And that is why we have never sat down to have a discussion with a group of rural subjects or a group of indigenous subjects. We have never tried to do that. And once we do that, we will perhaps see that, number one, as I've said, the other is wise. Number two, envisioning would also mean n number of visions, actually. It's not one vision. So we have been pushed to one vision and not n number of visions, and that can open up. So, Somajit, your title changes a little bit, okay? Envisioning otherwise. And there, and I've shared this with some of you before, I'm repeating, I was trying to do something on development with a group of indigenous women, the Chinhari group, very young actually. They call themselves Chinhari, the young India. Chinhari comes from Chinna in Chhattisgarh, in Dhamtari district, Sharad, actually. We have also worked in the places where you have been. And as the discussion was going on, rich and poor, etc., little bit of Marx without naming him was being discussed. One of the youngest members actually, Keshwati Netam, a Gond Adivasi woman, she said, "Sir, there are two kinds of people in the world, not just rich and poor. Some who grow their own food and some who buy food." And like that one person, I was immediately ashamed, okay? It had folded back on me like a mirror that I am damn the person who buys food and she is the person who grows food. Okay? And we have done everything possible to destroy the lives of those, including all our agricultural policies in the last 70 years, to destroy the life world and the world view of those who grow their own food. and we have become the speakers of this assembly where we talk about them. Two, the normal abnormal division in psychology, medicine, sometimes psychoanalysis also, gets rewritten over here as the developed, underdeveloped division. Underdeveloped has no definition, actually. We have just added an under to that definition of developed, which we will keep changing from time to time. And the other has to catch up over here. And here, actually, I still find Amartya Sen interesting, where he argues that the camel is not an inferior horse. The camel is not a dwarfed horse. The camel is a different animal, a different other, actually. But what we have done is that we have actually not managed to, speak to the camel and the horse. We have spoken to the camel in horse language, and that is what we have done. And here there are two traps, I think, and I think we are complicit in this trap. I say this with some trepidation. Perhaps I'll be heavily criticized for this, but two terms, I think, have not done us much good. One, pre-modern, calling the other pre-modern means I have put the other in a telos of the modern. I have already reached there and you have to come up. This is also Ashish Nandi's idea, not mine only, that you have to come up and become modern, which we call modernism, which we call the modernist vision of development. The second, and here is, I think, our secret Orientalism. I would call it brown Orientalism, not the Orientalism of the white, but internal Orientalism of all of us, actually. The other term is pre-capitalist. Pre-capitalist is also the same telos, actually, that the other will have to climb the ladder up and reach capitalism. So, and I know these two terms have been used all over the social sciences, and I would really like to put this on the table, that have we really landed into this normal, abnormal, developed, underdeveloped, capitalist, pre-capitalist, modern, pre-modern divide. And that can be very, very problematic. So the psychic question, Somajit, is not only what the other thinks, that, oh, the other has aspirations, okay? I don't get too troubled by that. The other has aspirations, we also have aspirations, okay? So in that sense, what is more important is how our imagination has been colonized, how we remain interpellated. Let me invoke a term, capitalocentrism. We are all critiques of capitalism, but we can be very, very unknowingly capitalocentric in our thought. We may see capital as the telos, as the ladder, that all of us have to go that path, and we may be pushed into that, actually. So it's a kind of an unconscious, I actually would call it capitalocentrism is unconscious. Our critiques of capitalism are conscious, our complicity in capitalocentrism, and the analog is this, androcentrism, phallocentrism. These are unconscious processes, actually. So Eurocentrism. Similarly, there can be capitalocentrism, actually. Imagination, last point, actually. Imagination, but whose imagination, actually, Somajit? That becomes very, very important. And I felt Peter's book, that introduction, set up the imagination question very, very well. Imagination also pushes us towards questioning, politicizing what is imagination. So how do we reach an imagination? Is it a bird's eye view that we have, or do we have an earthworm's view? An earthworm's view would actually, and I'll bring back the soil metaphor, the earthworm has soil tied to her body. Okay, the bird is looking at development from above. And in that sense, the earthworm view with the soil smeared on the body is a very different view of development. which Spivak, I think, puts it beautifully, learning to learn from below. Not learning from below, learning to learn from below. Because how do we do that? It really requires a mirror, how to learn from below. And that means short-term commitments to righting wrongs. Writing is not W-R-I, it's R-I-G-H-T-I-N-G. Short-term commitment to righting wrongs, which is development actually. What is the ecological or the political ecological question pushing us to now? That there are no way we will get to short-term righting wrongs. We will not be, but that is not to say short-term righting wrongs should not be done. Of course they should be done, okay? But long-term commitment to understanding, let me put it this way, this is, Shomajit, the language of the psychological or the psychoanalytic in development and ecology, if that is what we are discussing today. The psychological or the psychoanalytic language over here would be, what is our long-term commitment to listening to social suffering and reaching a form of social healing? So, social suffering and social healing is, if you want a psychological language, is the psychological translation of economic development. And I'm happy that this opens up. Just last one point where I really agree with Sharad actually and want to do that. Let me put it this way. Social diagnosis or diagnosis in medicine, say for example, produces a certain kind of knowledge. But healing or cure produces a different or an additional knowledge. In the social sciences, have we for too long relied on the knowledge that diagnosis produces? Does healing, and clinical medicine is a very good example, clinical psychoanalysis is a very good example, that can the process of healing produce a knowledge that diagnosis cannot produce? So a diagnosis of development is one. A process of social healing can produce a very different insight, and in that insight the other may wisely support us, which perhaps we have missed for long. So, will you give me one more minute? I like actually Professor Raina's point, the point you made actually, and I hear this in our discussions all the time actually, that, well, the North has destroyed the planet, why will the South, whatever, yeah, degrowth means why will the South take the responsibility of planetary destruction? And I can only remember the work of two Indian thinkers actually, and both are quite dangerous. One, Tagore, Shobhata Shankar, Crisis of Civilization, where he is arguing and telling the West, you have made a mess, and the emancipatory insight may come from the East. Number one. So we need not repeat the West's mistakes and then try to correct it. Number two, Gandhi. It's a more dangerous suggestion. In a phrase-like form, though he never used the word like this, it's what is the ethics of the oppressed? What is the ethics of the marginalized? One will definitely have to think of the ethics of the master, the ethics of the oppressor, and we will always call out the oppressor or the master, and we will always question the West. But what would be the ethics of the oppressed or the ethics of the marginalized? So I actually do not want to really say anymore, and it's a dangerous suggestion, I know, that the South will not take responsibility. The South may actually show the way to the North. Sometimes a child shows us, the adults, where we are deeply wronged, actually. The South is, of course, not a child, but the South is civilizationally older, actually, perhaps, okay? It's the grandmom and of history. And the South may actually, from two perspectives, the ethics of the oppressed in Gandhi and crisis of civilization in Tagore, suggest that we will show the way to degrowth or an envisioned growth, and otherwise kind of growth. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think we have like such rich point that has been brought about, and now in keeping in mind the time, I would like to kind of open it up for some cross discussions, provided there is if any of you want to comment on each other's point, and then maybe after 10 minutes we'll open it up to the audience. We might, with your permission, extend the session by 10 minutes. We lost 10 minutes in the beginning because of the technical glitch. But yeah, obviously you are feel free to leave if you want. So if any of you want to just pick on any threads that all of you have raised, yeah.
Sure. I can just very quick intervention. Listening to the other three panelists, the word that kept coming up for me was wisdom. I think there is a lot of wisdom on this panel, and actually it's a really great honor for somebody from my generation of scholars to be on the same panel with these three people. But wisdom also as a concept actually is something that we also talk about in the book, and the difference between intelligence and wisdom, and collective intelligence and collective wisdom. One of the joys of writing a book like this is that you get to go and look at all kinds of obscure literatures and papers that have sort of gone into oblivion. And I found one from the 90s from a certain French philosopher who was at the time talking about the promise of the internet and the idea of collective intelligence, and how communication and information technologies will bring us together and will enable us to have this collective sort of mind as humans. And this will solve all our problems. There's this very sort of techno-optimist writing from the 90s as these technologies are emerging. And then you look at, in the rearview mirror of what actually happened, and what these technologies did, and what this promise of collective intelligence actually meant. And then in contrast to that, you've got the concept of collective wisdom, which some scholars have theorized, have written about. And this is where the point that Rajeswari you made about the amputation of time from discourse becomes really important, because wisdom always has a temporal element. Wisdom is something that accumulates over time. It's not instantaneous. It doesn't belong to a single generation. And I think a lot of the wisdom certainly that I learned or heard in this conversation is a kind of intergenerational wisdom. These are things that have emerged from conversations across time, conversations across history, conversations with other generations, perhaps even conversations with generations that are not yet here, imagined generations. And so I think the reimagination of development and collective wisdom, to me, come hand in hand. But of course, we are being pulled in a very different direction with the entire discourse around artificial intelligence. Once again, intelligence, not wisdom. Right? So the current moment we're in, I think just like the 90s, forces us to think about, is intelligence truly the thing that we're after, or is it wisdom? And how do we move from intelligence to wisdom?
So just to add to that point, you had mentioned several centrisms, so capitalocentrism, Eurocentrism, and a couple of more. I'd like to add to that, and I think that speaks to your point, Peter, also the idea of technocentrism. And of course, many of these go hand in hand, you might say, that capitalism, the evolution of capitalism or emergence of industrial and post-industrial capitalism goes very strongly with, of course, the Industrial Revolution. But I feel that in our conversation about development and underdevelopment, modernity and pre-modernity and so on, we have to confront this question of technology and while technocentrism is a legitimate critique, the fact that we are sitting in an air-conditioned room and using YouTube and maybe even tomorrow using artificial intelligence and so on, speaks to the fact that I think there is a moment in time, and I remember, Peter, in your earlier book on educating for the Anthropocene, you've sort of discussed this question of when does the Anthropocene begin. And at some point, of course, you say that's not particularly important, but nevertheless, one of the points that you have, points in time that you have flagged is the Industrial Revolution. And I think it's really important for us to engage with the question of what that moment in time brought about and why it took us down a certain path where we are today, where we, on the one hand, see the dangers of technocentrism, the dangers of artificial intelligence, or the place that we are in vis-a-vis the internet and so on, and at the same time cannot let go, and at the same time feel almost helpless when, obviously extremely powerful capitalists control artificial intelligence, and then the only conversation around AI, for example, is how do we adapt to it, right? How do we adapt to it? How do we adapt to it in the classroom, in the medical profession, in whatever? I mean, in every context, the only conversation is how do we adapt to artificial intelligence rather than who controls that technology. Who controls that technology? Because that is what is then controlling the evolution and the direction of that technology, right? And that's true across the board, whether it is medical technology, which is clearly beneficial. We can talk about indigenous knowledge, and at the same time, we also have to place side by side the cures to whether it is tuberculosis, whether it is malaria, whether it is typhoid and so on, that modern technology has brought, and keep asking this question, I think, again and again. How do we avoid technocentrism and at the same time engage with technology in a more creative and a more meaningful, more just and a more sustainable manner? Just wanted to table that thought.
Can I add a line here? Actually, Sharad, that's a very important point actually. Is technology the problem or technocentrism the problem? Is science the problem or scientism the problem actually? And one of the I think again collapse that we really need to question, and this panel is to question actually, is the conflation of capitalism and technology. Technology precedes capitalism by many thousand years, actually. So the first wheel, the first fire, actually cooking, preservation. Okay. So technology is not equivalent or equal to capitalism, but in our discussions sometimes we tend to actually collapse the two, and they are temporarily collapsed also, and then spatially collapsed also, that it's West Europe where all this is happening. But I think, so your point helps us actually, that can we slowly, even in our pedagogy, Peter is interested in education, in pedagogy actually, begin to teach in a school or a class that technology precedes capitalism. Technology precedes what we are calling industrial revolution actually. So that so reclaiming these become a little bit
Yeah, I'll open it. Just one final comment that I would like to make before we open up. So one of the key points, and that's kind of, you can say, coming from my own personal question also. We do see that in all of their exposition, it is evident that decentralization is the key, and we have to decentralize to be able to reimagine. We have to decentralize to have any form of democracy which can function, and also decentralizations lead to better outcomes in various ways. But the question is that whenever we see some radical movement happening, which is currently one happening in Nepal, we tend to see that eventually it gets into some centralization. So the question that kind of it comes to me always, that what is there about human beings that we always tend to go into this master and slave kind of a kind of structure inherently, And whenever we say direct democracy and whatever participative democratic policies, it's all where you have to challenge this fundamentally. So I just sometimes wonder whether it's something to do with our mind or as a collective how we function, that we tend to fall back again and again. And what it seems, Bangladesh was a classic example, and I don't think Nepal is going to really lead to something which is very different from what the protest was initially sparked by this whatever centralization of power, extreme corruption, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's just a opening, but I think let us take questions. But if panelist wants to kind of reflect on that while the questions comes, we will do it. We have about 15-20 minutes time, so we have time. Questions? Yeah. Can we get some two students? Hi, one minute.
Hi, it's a general question. Maybe I haven't read this book yet. I read the earlier book on development and documentary films. What I'm prompted to think of today is that yes, we should, like Anup said, we should have talked to people, the other Adivasis and so on. But there's another group, when most of these conversations between economics and anthropology happens, it happens in the shared ground of this people-centric whatever. But these people who make fiscal policies, macroeconomic thought, what are their imaginations? Like the Bretton Woods and the Reserve Bank and the liquidities and assets, what are they doing? Because they seem to be running the whole show, whereas we seem to be talking in the margin, In most of the seminars I used to feel that, but that they never used to be present. And, but we don't know them. But they're running the world. And so what is that imagination? Name is not coming to me, the more heat than light. What is his name? Peter, yeah, Miroski. Yeah. So like the Miroski's intervention. So we need to try to tackle that, Maybe I don't know whether the book has it, but more hit and right, I couldn't understand much. But I was very much excited to read it. But when are we going to translate that and sort of, have access to who started running this world like this into, national currencies and reserve banks and Bretton Woods institutions and so on. Unless we have a dialogue with them, it's like we cannot always talk to the people, we have to talk up also, who are these big powers like Brodel said. So what are they doing? What is their imagination? It's also very important. Thank you.
Good evening. So there are some challenges in envisioning otherwise, which are posed by the critics. The major one is that if you are envisioning otherwise, we are going back, and there is some romanticization of parochial structures and all. There is some truth also in this critiques, because if we see that if we are talking of non-technological development, or can we really do outgrowth and the material growth, can we get rid of material growth and all, we can see the figure of infant mortality or maternal mortality in the tribal areas also. So as Professor Lele also said about that we need to go beyond Jal, Jungle and Jameen, because it is an outdated slogan now. And also about liberal education and medicine in liberal sector. It has emancipatory framework also for those who are facing structural, systematic and hierarchical issues in parochial structure. So how we can do with this alternative idea with accommodating the differences in the critiques also? Thank you.
Thanks for wonderful insights. I think all the panelists made point about the idea of imagination. And I feel like the kind of pessimist part of me asks, when we talk about imagination, how do we really imagine when the very imagination itself is polluted? When I say imagination is polluted, because already mentioned that big structure name that is the capitalism, and capitalism has this wonderful tool called advertisement. For example, capitalism will ask us, how do you see or how you show a mother's relationship with her child? And capitalism would say in older advertisement, give Johnson and Johnson baby powder, or how do you show your affection towards your partner by gold during Akshaya Tritiya, right? So our imagination is like polluted, and we live in the superstructure situation. And how do we reimagine? And Professor Dhar kind of threw light in some of the things when you spoke, and Sharath also you mentioned that the technocentrism, and we ask fundamental questions about, like, while we are questioning or critiquing, we are using some of these things. And what will be the way of reimagining to tackle the kind of desire called development? Is it like somebody mentioned, going back to the romanticized notions, or everything is like primitive would good, or it is like a new cooperatives or communes and so on, or some kind of completely overthrowing the system, which, I mean, I don't want to use the word, but you mentioned revolution. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know if I should take the question about Philip Mirowski's book. Yes, there is a lot of talk on that. Again, there are some scholars who ask, who are the people who are against this? That's what I was saying in terms of the resilience of a rotten system. It's a very, very bad system, but it has ways of, it has feedback loops that help the system to bounce back to a relative normal, which is a really unhealthy normal that we have now. But the system seems to do that. It's that kind of training. It's, training in a particular kind of, economics if you want it, but again, the kind of capitalocentric thinking that drives the system. And that's where everything that is here today, material, non-material, biotic, abiotic, everything is one form of capital or the other. And I'm sorry to say this, I mean, I know many of you would have sympathies with, us would have sympathies with what we know as communism. But when it comes to the environment, when it comes to nature, communists and capitalists, I think, are the same. I mean, there's no difference. Both of them see nature as resources, extract, pollute, doesn't make any difference, I'm sorry. Whereas Marx in volume 3 says that soil and labor are the two original sources of all wealth. Soil and labor are the two original sources of all, and are the most oppressed throughout the history of humanity. Now, when did Marxists drop soil? Now, when did they drop the earthworm, right? So we have to ask these questions. And I'm really grateful that you mentioned Mirowski. Of course, we don't teach those texts in our teaching. So the envisioning otherwise, and are we going back? It's not a question of going back. I don't think it's a question of going back. While infant mortality and maternal mortality, morbidity are major concerns, we have to see, I mean, what I mentioned in agriculture, the sector that I know best, about major minerals and nutrients missing, 9 major minerals and nutrients missing in the kind of food we eat, rice and wheat produced in the Green Revolution Belt in particular. We've known this, we don't do anything about it. 80% or more of India's women are anemic. Yeah? It's not a question of going back, it's a question of correcting things, righting things, as Anup said. How do we correct these? And that correction cannot happen unless we have decentralized, again, local, fresh food produced and consumed, nutritious food, leaves, stuff that we can actually harvest from our local ecosystems, not perhaps in urban Delhi, yes, not in the metros, but the places where you mentioned infant mortality is high, definitely possible. Sourcing new ways of relating to nature through agriculture and food is one of the best ways to do it. But then again, agriculture is one sector, coming back to Sir's question about Bretton Woods, agriculture is one sector that development economics tells us must shrink in its value in GDP, because that is development. Agriculture is one sector that must shrink in its contribution to the workforce, that is development. The tropics are perhaps not made for that. Yeah? And these theorizations, nobody is made for that, absolutely. Absolutely, except if you pump in petroleum, fossil fuels, yes. But if you have at all theorized based on the development experience of one or two temperate countries, at the very least what we can say is, this is not going to work here. But we have all bought into it. It's not going back. It's actually questioning what happened in the past, but like Peter was saying, imagining what the future would be like. Ask questions about what would real biophysical material value added mean as good food. How can we tell a household that you may not earn 100 rupees more this week, but you will spend 0 on healthcare? You will not have that kind of expenditure. That is not going back. That is a much more progressive step. And I think we can do that. There are so many, hundreds of examples in this country, but we don't seem to be learning from this. The last bit about imagination itself being polluted, yes, it is unfortunately the case. But then, Thorstein Veblen, who wrote about advertisement as the biggest persuasion of, well, not just of the capitalist firm or the American firms at that time, but of the entire nation state. We don't teach Veblen, right? We don't teach those institutions, patterns of relationships, rules, norms making. So coming back to Peter's book and the question about how do we educate people about our younger generation, ourselves, about this, I think we have to bring in some of these earlier debates back to our...
Oh, Peter, go first. No, Peter.
Well, I just thought I'd say something because it's a rare point of slight disagreement in the panel on that last point. If you read the book, you'll see that the way the book conceptualizes imagination is that there is no such thing as polluted imagination. Imagination is a bricolage. It's not one thing. The only question is how wide, how broad your imagination is, and how much can you sort of fit into it, because all of those stimuli become ways of learning, they become ways of reimagining the world. And if you think about it through that lens, then even capitalism, dare I say it, is something we can actually learn from. Not just learn how not to do things, but also learn how to do things, because there are many different types of capitalism. There are many different ways that people have gone about organizing themselves in a capitalist way throughout history, and even in the contemporary world, there are different forms of capital organization. So if all of that becomes food for imagination, if none of it sort of gets labeled as bad or polluted, but it just becomes a way of learning and trying to understand how did societies end up organized in this way, and what can we learn from that? What needs is this meant to fulfill? I think a lot of the things that we label as sort of pathological or negative or destructive, they're sort of maladaptive ways of trying to address certain underlying needs. And as such, they are ways for us to learn about what it means to be human in the world. And I also wanted to say something about the elitist imagination. So there, I'm a little bit torn, because part of me really agrees with you that it's important to engage with the elitist imagination. But part of me also questions the premise of that question. One of the things that we say in the introduction is that both Uma, my co-author, and I grew up in the 90s at a time when the world was being radically remade. She in Nepal, I in Czechoslovakia. These were both places where in the early 90s there was dramatic transformation. In the book's conclusion, we cite the anthropologist Alexei Yurchak, who has worked on the sort of downfall of the Soviet Union and how even just a year or two before it happened, it just seemed totally impossible, and how overnight this happens. And in that moment, what becomes important is who steps into the vacuum, what kind of imaginary steps into the vacuum. And things on the margins suddenly become mainstream. I mean, Czech Republic, first post-independence president was a playwright who came from prison into the palace. So these kinds of examples historically do exist, and we sort of own that maybe there is a certain idealism and a certain naivete that we bring to this conversation as people who grew up in those kinds of places at that point in time. And I'll just end with a very pessimistic note, which is that there's interesting work in theology, actually, on some of these questions, and I'm reminded of the work by Roy Scranton, who argues that our current civilization is already dead. We just haven't realized it, or most of us haven't realized it. And if that is the case, then there's just this sort of inertia, momentum of the current systems that is just finishing up, and something else is about to come. And what that something is, then again, depends on what is there in the margins. You know, what are we able to keep alive in the margins to fill in that vacuum of the collapsing civilization?
It's like a star that is dead, but the light is still coming to Earth. No, three lines. One, the macro view may not be good enough, actually. We may need more microscopic views, okay? So when we are saying capitalism generally, we have a macro view only. That is one. Number two, when we drive a car, we have to negotiate and balance between the windscreen view and the rear view mirror. So it's not going back. It's to balance between imaginations that get seen through the rear view mirror, and they require an audit, actually. They have to be critically audited. And through the windscreen view, as Sharath put it actually, that medical technology definitely has transformed lives significantly. But should we give all the credit to capitalism for that? I think we need a more disaggregated, decentered micro view of that. So in that sense, macro view will not work very well. We need a micro view, and a balance between the windscreen and the rear view mirror becomes very, very important. The third point is that if we say all imagination is polluted, then we are actually allowing the developmentalists to say all are underdeveloped, all are superstitious, all are backward, smash them. Rural agriculture is terrible, smash them. So I think again over there we need a more complicated, disaggregated view, and including, Rajan, elite imaginations. Of late I have met some rich people, and they have imagination actually. They have a way of thinking. They think I'm stupid, but it's an interesting conversation with them. So let us not again go into that normal, abnormal, polluted, pure and pollution. This is a caste society. I would hesitate to use pure and polluted actually over here. I think let us not see everything as polluted now, or us as exclusively pure. No, we are not. We are not, actually.
Just wanted to add to that, you ended in this question of binaries, right? Pure and polluted. I was just thinking that the response to your question is, in a sense that we need to go beyond binaries. Forward and backward, modern and pre-modern, and all the kind of binaries. So, good society and bad society, that's also binary. And I think the only way we can go beyond binaries is by thinking in multiple dimensions. So what is the definition of a good society? Because then that will tell us that the past was also good in only some parts maybe, and was bad in some other parts. And the future, unless we visualize it differently, will again be like the Nepal revolution will come, and you'll have some small bad parts washed away, but again replication of the many of the evils that continue. So I think we need a much more multi-dimensional view of what is a good society, rather than just saying, oh, good society is what is not bad, in that sense. So we talk about well-being, we have to talk about justice, we have to talk about sustainability, we have to talk about the well-being of non-humans, and we have to talk about a democratic process of decision-making. These kind of 5 circles at least provide us some multidimensional thinking on what is a good society. If we just say, well, a good society is where everybody is well off or something, that's not going to happen, and that's not really going to address all the concerns that we bring to the table. So we need to allow for the possibilities that in the pursuit of, for example, justice, if you're not careful, you will sacrifice sustainability. In the pursuit of justice as an end goal, as equity in the communist case, you had sacrificed process. You completely sacrificed process and said that the party, People's Party, will tell you, will take you to an equitable society by wiping out maybe a few million undesirables in China or whatever, right? So I'm saying in pursuit of any one dimension of that good society vision alone will definitely jeopardize other dimensions. There is no perfect win-win. That I think we have to acknowledge. And similarly then coming to the diagnosis of why are we so far away from that definition of or that goal of a good society, if we just have one diagnosis, oh it's capitalism, oh it's masculinity, oh it is developmentalism, oh it is whatever, then again we are in a binary in a sense. We are only using one diagnosis of the problem. We know the problem, the reasons why we are so far away from a good society are again multiple. And trying to reduce everything has been part of, I think the point you made that we've, in academia, we are so fragmented. I mean, I'm talking about those who might believe in, sort of a similar ideas of good society and yet not be able to make a difference in the real world is because we are incredibly fragmented in our diagnosis of why we are far away from that goal. And if I am stuck with the notion that capitalism is the problem, then I cannot talk to him because he subscribed to some other, maybe he's a gender person and then it's only talking about the role of gender in taking us away from that goal. So we have carved out these silos, and although all of us perhaps think that we are progressive, liberal, thinking of the the right kind of goal and so on. And I think that is our equal challenge, having a multidimensional goal, but also multi-causal analysis of why we are far away, so that we can come up with a very nuanced notion of how we can make a difference. Yeah, thank you.
Hello. Not a question exactly, but just to substantiate to what Professor Lele. Okay. Yeah, better. So I think the question about romanticizing the past and everything, and what Professor Lele and Professor Dhar said, the point is exactly is to. It is not about romanticizing actually. It is just about acknowledging that there are multiple and pluriversal knowledges that exist, and it is not about good and bad exactly, but to learn from them what do they offer for us. I mean, discarding them outrightly, saying that oh, we are being romantic and going back to the past, it is not the case. I think all such indigenous and knowledge systems, these have a tendency to teach us to be resilient, to be useful in contemporary times as well. It is not just going back to something so-called, I won't say it, but otherwise because it will be entirely politically a bad argument to quote here. But the question is to acknowledge, learn, and just think of them as an alternative to what we have already built on. I mean, and not just going back to past. About Professor Dhar's argument about technology preceding capitalism, it is actually true, because in case if you see how the artisans, local artisans, they build on their own knowledge, how they each and every day they come up with new techniques and new ideas to not just sustain their own craft, but also make it more contemporary and relevant, and also somehow produce, quote unquote, in large numbers. It is not that they are not technically advanced. So what is technology actually? What are our ideas of technology? That is a question. I mean, if we say that they are not technically sound, I would say, no, we have to rethink that what is technology. So yeah, precisely.
All of us are becoming Japanese, I guess.
So, yeah, I think I would not try the audacious act of summarizing the discussion, because obviously the point was of decentralization and multiplicity of imaginations and of thoughts. So on that note, and also much of the objectives of SOLS conversations is not to resolve issues, but to kind of open them up for further reflections and discussions. So on that note, I hand over the proceedings to Dr. Anish to do the rest of the event.
I would like to sincerely thank our panel for a deep, thought-provoking and wide-ranging discussions. I mean, undoubtedly, you all have offered us not just a critique, but also tools to imagine and to begin thinking about building, and also to ponder about developmental features, which I think, to put it in Professor Somajit's remark, would be ecological, democratic, and plural and just. So, thank you all of you. Also, I would like to thank all the, to the audience for asking very engaging questions, which I think can lead to, very interesting and meaningful discussions. Moving on further, I would now we would now gladly like to present tokens of appreciation and felicitate our invited speakers and panelists. I would first request Professor Arindam Banerjee to come and felicitate Professor Peter Sutoris, please. I would now request Professor Anandini Dhar to felicitate Professor Sharachchandra Lele. And I would request Professor Manu Matthews to felicitate Professor Rajeswari Raina. Thank you, Professor Arindam. Thank you, Professor Andrini and Professor Manu. So we now conclude the session. So on behalf of the School of Liberal Studies of the BML Munjal University, I offer a sincere gratitude to all who made this evening possible. To our panelists, Professor Peter Sutoris, Professor Sharachchandra Lele, Professor Rajeswari Raina, and Professor Anup Dhar, thank you for your intellectual generosity and clarity. You have all expanded the frame through which we think about development in the global south, reminding us that it is not only one question of policy, but of ethics, effect, and imagination, and a lot more things to discuss. I would also like to thank our moderator, Professor Somajit Dhar. Thank you for crafting and guiding the conversation with care and precision and in a coherent manner. I would like to thank our Dean, Professor Arindam Banerjee. Thank you for your consistent leadership and for nurturing this space for public dialogue and interdisciplinary inquiry. Thank you. We are also grateful to Professor Shah Menon, the Vice Chancellor of BML Munjal University, for his support and encouragement of critical academic programming. Our sincere thanks to the communications team, IT team, events, and administrative teams at the BML Munjal University for their detailed planning and support. This all has happened because of them. And also special thanks to Meghna Sharma for, yeah, she's from the Dean's office and for perfectly coordinating the logistics for us so efficiently. Okay, so yeah. And also we are grateful and also thank our venue partners at the Indian Islamic Cultural Center for providing us this venue. And especially we want to thank all our student volunteers, especially a big thanks to them for their behind the scenes efforts, which made everything run so smoothly. Also, most importantly, we thank you, our audience, I mean here in the room and online, those who are attending it online, for your presence and engagement. We hope this evening has sparked new questions, new collaborations, new ways of thinking and revisiting certain ideas. We also look forward to seeing you at the next edition now of the SOLS Conversations. Thank you and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
And before we end, I want to thank Dr. Anish for comparing the session. Thank you, Anish.